Some wishes once made echo through a lifetime, waiting patiently to be remembered. Margaret Whitmore stood in the doorway of Pinehurst Lodge, her breath forming small clouds in the December air as she stared at the dust-covered Christmas village spread across the mantelpiece. She and Harold had driven 4 hours through winding Vermont mountain roads to assess this inheritance, a property she'd never known existed until her aunt's lawyer called 3 weeks ago. The lodge felt frozen in time, as if Christmas morning had arrived in 1955 and simply never left. Garland hung from every doorframe, stockings dangled from the stone fireplace, and beneath a magnificent 8-foot Douglas fir, wrapped presents sat untouched for decades. But it was the letters that made Margaret's hands tremble. Scattered across an antique writing desk were hundreds of envelopes addressed to Santa Claus, their careful cursive handwriting faded but still legible. Children's Christmas wishes from generations past, requests for bicycles, dolls, and ponies. Margaret smiled at their innocence until she reached the bottom of the pile and found an envelope that made her blood run cold. The handwriting was unmistakably her own, but from a childhood she couldn't remember. What secrets had her family kept buried in this forgotten Christmas sanctuary? And why was her past calling to her from letters she'd never written? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's legs gave way beneath her, and she sank into the worn leather chair beside the desk. The envelope trembled in her arthritic fingers as she studied the careful loops and curves of handwriting she recognized, as intimately as her own reflection, yet had no memory of creating. Dear Santa, the letter began in faded blue ink. I wish for my mama to stop crying at night when she thinks I'm sleeping. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She pressed her free hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammering against her ribs. Her mother had never cried, at least, not that Margaret remembered. Eleanor Ashford had been stern, practical, emotionally distant. The idea of her weeping seemed as foreign as finding snow in July. Margaret? Harold's voice drifted from somewhere deeper in the lodge. You need to see the kitchen. The copper pots alone are worth a small fortune. She couldn't respond. Her throat had constricted, and her vision blurred as she continued reading. She misses my daddy so much since he went away to the bad place. I don't understand why he had to go there, but I wish he could come home for Christmas so Mama won't be sad anymore. Margaret's father had never gone anywhere. Robert Ashford had been a steady presence throughout her childhood, a quiet man who worked at the bank and read the evening paper in his armchair after dinner. He'd lived with them until his peaceful death from a heart attack when Margaret was 32. There had never been any bad place, no mysterious absence that would have left her mother crying. Yet the letter felt true in a way that made her bones ache. She set it aside with trembling hands and reached for another envelope bearing her childhood script. This one was dated December 1959, when she would have been 8 years old. Dear Santa, it read, I wish for a best friend who will never leave me. Someone who will understand when I'm scared and who won't think I'm strange for seeing things that aren't supposed to be there. Margaret had never had imaginary friends or claimed to see things others couldn't. She'd been a perfectly ordinary child, studious, well-behaved, unremarkable. At least, that's what she'd always believed. But as she stared at the letter, a fragment of memory flickered at the edge of her consciousness. A girl with dark braids standing at the foot of her bed, whispering about the shadow people in the walls. Margaret had tried to tell her mother about the visitor, but Eleanor had dismissed it as nonsense and threatened to take away her books if she didn't stop making up stories. The memory felt both foreign and familiar, like glimpsing yourself in an old photograph you'd forgotten existed. Good Lord, Margaret. There's a whole set of spode Christmas china in here that looks like it's never been used. Harold's voice stopped abruptly as he appeared in the doorway and saw her face. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Harold Whitmore had been her husband for 42 years, and in all that time she'd rarely seen him truly worried. He was a man who approached problems with methodical precision, a retired engineer who believed every mystery had a logical solution. But now his weathered face creased with concern, as he took in her pale complexion and shaking hands. "These letters," she managed to whisper. "Harold, I think I wrote these when I was a child." He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, his boots echoing on the hardwood floors. "What do you mean? Letters to Santa?" She held up the envelope, pointing to the careful cursive. "Look at the handwriting. It's mine, but I don't remember writing them. And the things they say, they're about memories I don't have." Harold adjusted his reading glasses and studied the letter she'd handed him. His expression shifted from concern to confusion, then to something that looked almost like fear. "Margaret, your father never went anywhere. I knew Robert for 15 years before he died. He was the most reliable man I ever met. I know that." Her voice came out sharper than she'd intended. "But this letter says otherwise. And when I read it—" She paused, struggling to find words for the sensation. "When I read it, I can almost remember her crying. I can almost see her sitting at the kitchen table after I'd gone to bed, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while tears ran down her cheeks." Harold sat heavily on the edge of the desk, making the old wood creak. Snow had begun to fall outside, casting shifting shadows through the frosted windows. The lodge felt even more isolated now, cut off from the world by the gathering storm. "There has to be an explanation," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe another child with similar handwriting. Maybe your aunt kept letters from all sorts of children who visited here." Margaret wanted to believe him. She'd built her life on certainties, their comfortable retirement, their planned cruise next spring, the predictable rhythm of their days. But the letters felt like cracks in the foundation of everything she thought she knew about herself. And she was terrified of what might crumble if she kept pulling at the loose threads of her past. Margaret folded the letters carefully and tucked them into her coat pocket, though her hands still trembled. "We should head back before the snow gets worse," she said, avoiding Harold's searching gaze. "We can sort through more of this tomorrow." The drive down the mountain was treacherous, their rental car's headlights cutting weak paths through the swirling snow. Harold gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his usual confident driving replaced by cautious navigation of the winding road. Neither of them spoke until they reached the valley floor and the welcoming lights of their bed and breakfast. The Green Mountain Inn was everything the lodge wasn't: warm, well-maintained, filled with the comfortable chatter of other guests seeking refuge from the storm. Margaret nodded politely to the elderly proprietor as they climbed the narrow stairs to their room, but her mind remained fixed on the impossibility tucked against her ribs. Their evening routine unfolded with the practiced efficiency of 4 decades together. Harold hung their coats in the small closet while Margaret set out their medications on the bedside table. His blood pressure pills, her calcium supplements, the small pharmacy that had gradually accumulated with age. She'd always found comfort in these rituals, the reliable architecture of their shared life. Harold emerged from the bathroom in his blue-striped pajamas, the same style he'd worn since their wedding. His hair, what remained of it, stuck up in familiar cowlicks that she'd smoothed down thousands of mornings. At 71, he moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body no longer obeyed without negotiation, but his mind remained sharp as the day she'd met him in Professor Caldwell's statistics class. "Do you want to call Janet tonight?" he asked, settling into the room's single armchair with his crossword puzzle book. "Let her know we made it safely." Margaret paused while brushing her teeth. Their daughter lived in Seattle with her investment banker husband and 2 teenagers who barely acknowledged their grandparents' existence. Janet called dutifully every Sunday, their conversations following predictable patterns: weather, health updates, brief reports on the grandchildren's academic achievements. Love was present, but carefully contained, like flowers pressed between the pages of a book. "Tomorrow," Margaret said, rinsing her mouth. "She'll be getting the kids ready for school." She knew Harold worried about the distance between them and their only child. He'd never said so directly, but she caught him sometimes staring at photographs of Janet as a little girl, as if trying to solve the equation that had transformed their laughing, imaginative daughter into a woman who scheduled affection like business meetings. Margaret had accepted it as the natural order of things. Children grew up, moved away, built lives that had little room for aging parents. She'd done the same with her own mother, visiting Eleanor out of duty rather than desire until the old woman's death 5 years ago. It was simply how families worked. But now, lying in the narrow bed beside Harold's familiar breathing, she found herself wondering about the child who had written those letters. Had that little girl imagined growing old in a marriage where conversations rarely ventured beyond weather and grocery lists? Had she dreamed of children who would visit twice a year, staying just long enough to fulfill obligations before escaping back to their real lives? Margaret had always believed she'd lived exactly the life she'd chosen. She'd met Harold in college, married him after graduation, taught elementary school until Janet was born, then devoted herself to creating the kind of stable, peaceful home her own childhood had lacked. They'd saved diligently, traveled modestly, and looked forward to a retirement filled with the small pleasures they'd deferred: gardening, reading, perhaps finally taking that European river cruise they'd discussed for years. It was a good life, a sensible life, the kind of existence her practical mother would have approved of, built on realistic expectations and careful planning. So why did it suddenly feel like she'd been sleepwalking through someone else's dreams? Harold's crossword puzzle slipped from his fingers as sleep claimed him, and Margaret gently removed his reading glasses, setting them on the nightstand beside his inhaler. Even in sleep, his face carried the worry lines that had deepened over the past year. Retirement hadn't suited him as well as he'd expected. Without the structured demands of his engineering firm, he seemed smaller somehow, uncertain of his purpose. She'd suggested volunteering at the local literacy center, maybe teaching basic math to adult learners. He'd nodded politely and never mentioned it again. Instead, he filled his days with home improvement projects and elaborate grocery shopping expeditions, attacking each task with the methodical precision that had once solved complex engineering problems, but now served mainly to avoid acknowledging how little either of them was needed anymore. The letters crinkled softly as Margaret shifted position, their presence both comforting and disturbing. Tomorrow they'd return to the lodge, probably decide it was too much work to renovate, and list it with a local realtor. They'd drive home to Connecticut, resume their quiet routines, and eventually the strange afternoon would fade into just another story about Margaret's eccentric aunt. That was what should happen. But the child's handwriting seemed to pulse against her chest like a second heartbeat, whispering questions Margaret wasn't sure she was brave enough to answer. Margaret drifted between sleep and wakefulness, her dreams populated by shadows that whispered in a child's voice. Each time she began to sink deeper into unconsciousness, the crinkle of paper against her nightgown would pull her back to the surface, reminding her of the impossible letters resting against her heart. At 3:17 in the morning, according to the glowing digits on the alarm clock, she gave up trying to sleep. Harold's breathing had settled into the steady rhythm she'd grown accustomed to over 4 decades, occasionally interrupted by the soft wheeze that meant he'd forgotten to use his inhaler before bed. She considered waking him, but decided against it. This strange restlessness felt too fragile to share, too uncertain to burden him with in the middle of the night. Moving carefully to avoid disturbing the old bed's creaking springs, Margaret slipped into her robe and padded to the window. The storm had intensified while they slept, transforming the village below into something from a Christmas card. Snow piled against window sills and door frames, and the streetlights cast golden halos through the swirling flakes. It was beautiful in the way that made her chest ache with unnamed longing. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching her breath fog the surface. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the snow-covered rooftops and the sleeping houses, the lodge waited in its hollow among the mountains. All those letters, all those children's wishes preserved in the darkness like pressed flowers. And somewhere among them, more evidence of a childhood she couldn't remember living. The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, it pulled at her with surprising urgency. Margaret found herself reaching for her clothes before she'd consciously decided to dress. Her movements felt automatic, guided by an impulse she didn't entirely understand. She pulled on her wool sweater and heaviest pants, then sat on the edge of the bed to lace her boots. "Margaret?" Harold's voice emerged from the pillow, thick with sleep. "What are you doing?" She paused, one boot half-tied. "I need to go back to the lodge. Now?" He pushed himself up on his elbows, squinting at the clock. It's the middle of the night. And there's a blizzard. I know. She finished with her laces and stood, pulling on her coat. I can't stop thinking about those letters, Harold. There might be more of them. There might be answers. He was fully awake now, his engineering mind grappling with the illogical nature of her request. Answers to what? Margaret, you're talking about driving up a mountain road in a snowstorm to look at children's letters that may or may not have anything to do with you. She turned to face him, and something in her expression made him go very still. They do have something to do with me. I can feel it. It's like... She struggled to find words that wouldn't make her sound completely unhinged. It's like I've been living someone else's memories my entire life, and the real ones are hidden in that attic. Harold swung his legs over the side of the bed, reaching for his robe. Then we'll go back first thing in the morning, when it's light and the roads are clear, when we can see what we're doing. What if I lose my nerve by morning? The question escaped before she could stop it, revealing the fear that had been growing since she'd first seen her childhood handwriting. What if I wake up tomorrow and decide this is all nonsense, and we pack up and go home, and I spend the rest of my life wondering who I really am? The room fell silent, except for the wind rattling the old windows. Margaret could see Harold calculating distances and weather conditions, weighing risks against his wife's unprecedented urgency. In 42 years of marriage, she'd never asked him for anything this unreasonable. The roads will be impassable, he said finally. The inn has a 4-wheel drive vehicle. I saw it in the parking lot. She was already moving toward the door. I'll ask to borrow it. Margaret, stop. His voice carried the gentle authority he'd used when Janet was small and determined to do something dangerous. Listen to yourself. You want to wake up strangers in the middle of a blizzard, borrow their car, and drive into the mountains because of some old letters that might not even be yours. She paused with her hand on the doorknob, knowing he was right and not caring. Harold, what if everything I remember about my childhood is wrong? What if my father did disappear, and my mother did cry herself to sleep, and I blocked it all out somehow? What if I've been living a lie for 60 years? The questions hung between them like smoke, impossible to wave away. Margaret watched her husband's face cycle through expressions, confusion, concern, and something that might have been recognition. As if part of him, the part that had noticed how she sometimes flinched when he touched her unexpectedly, or how she checked locks twice before bed, had been waiting for this moment of reckoning. If that's true, Harold said quietly, then we go together. But not tonight, not in this storm. Margaret's hand tightened on the doorknob. Outside, the wind howled through the trees like voices calling her name. The letters crinkled against her chest, and she realized she was standing at the edge of a precipice she'd been approaching her entire life without knowing it. She could step back into the safety of her orderly existence, or she could leap into the unknown darkness of her past. The choice felt like drowning or learning to fly. Margaret released the doorknob as if it had burned her fingers. The metal felt suddenly cold against her palm, and she stepped back from the threshold that had seemed so urgent to cross moments before. Harold's words echoed in the small room, their reasonableness a stark contrast to the wild impulse that had nearly driven her into the storm. "You're right," she whispered, but the admission felt like swallowing glass. "Of course you're right." She moved to the window again, pressing her forehead against the frigid pane. The village below looked impossibly distant, as if the falling snow were erasing the world one flake at a time. What had she been thinking? She was a 68-year-old woman with arthritis in her knees and a husband who worried when she drove to the grocery store alone. The idea of navigating mountain roads in a blizzard was beyond foolish. It was potentially suicidal. Yet the rational part of her mind felt like a stranger's voice. "Come back to bed," Harold said gently. "We'll figure this out in the morning." But Margaret remained at the window, watching the snow accumulate on the sill. Each passing minute felt like opportunity slipping away, as if the answers she sought might disappear with daylight. What if there's nothing to figure out? What if I'm losing my mind? The question hung in the air like a confession. She'd been thinking it since the moment she'd seen her own handwriting on those impossible letters, but saying it aloud made it feel terrifyingly real. Her mother had begun showing signs of dementia in her 70s. forgetting names, repeating stories, growing confused about which decade she was living in. Eleanor had fought the diagnosis viciously, insisting that everyone else was wrong, that her memory was perfectly fine. Margaret had promised herself she'd never become that woman, clinging to delusions while her family watched helplessly. But how could you trust your own judgment when your mind might be the very thing betraying you? "You're not losing your mind," Harold said, though his voice carried less conviction than she needed to hear. "You're tired. We've been driving for 2 days, dealing with lawyers and paperwork. Finding those letters was shocking, that's all." She turned from the window to study her husband's face. Even in the dim light, she could see the careful way he was watching her, as if she might shatter at any moment. It was the same expression he'd worn 3 years ago when her doctor had found the lump in her breast, protective and terrified, and trying desperately to project confidence he didn't feel. The lump had been benign, but she remembered how Harold had treated her like spun glass for weeks afterward, insisting on driving her to every appointment, hovering anxiously whenever she seemed tired or distracted. She'd found his concern suffocating then, a reminder of how quickly their carefully constructed independence could crumble. Now she wondered if he was seeing another threat to their stability, another crack in the foundation of their predictable life together. "Maybe you're right," she said, beginning to unbutton her coat. "Maybe I'm just overwhelmed." But as she hung the coat back in the closet, the letters crinkled against her sweater, and she felt that strange pull again, not toward the door this time, but toward something deeper and more frightening than a midnight drive through the mountains. It was the pull toward questions that might not have answers she could live with. What if the childhood she remembered, safe, stable, unremarkable, was a fiction she'd constructed to survive something too terrible to recall? What if the real Margaret, the one who had written those letters, was buried so deeply that excavating her would destroy everything built on top? She thought of Janet, their responsible daughter who called every Sunday and sent tasteful birthday cards and had learned early not to expect too much emotional availability from her mother. What if Margaret's careful distance wasn't natural reserve but self-protection? What if she'd been keeping everyone at arm's length her entire adult life, because getting too close meant risking the kind of loss that had shaped those desperate childhood wishes? The idea was seductive and horrible in equal measure. It would explain so much: her difficulty expressing affection, her need for rigid routines, the way she sometimes felt like she was watching her own life from a great distance. But it would also mean that everything she'd built, every relationship she'd maintained, was founded on a fundamental lie about who she was. Margaret slipped back into bed beside Harold, but sleep felt impossible now. She lay in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside, feeling the weight of the letters against her nightgown like a physical manifestation of all the questions she was afraid to ask. By morning, the roads would be clear, and they could return to the lodge safely. Harold was right about that, just as he was right about everything else. But Margaret wasn't sure she wanted to be safe anymore. She was beginning to suspect that safety had cost her more than she'd ever imagined possible. The pre-dawn hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margaret lay rigid beside Harold, listening to the storm's fury gradually diminish into occasional gusts that rattled the inn's old windows. She watched the digital clock's numbers change, 4:17, 4:43, 5:22, each minute feeling like a small death of possibility. At 6 o'clock, she gave up the pretense of rest and slipped quietly from the bed. Harold stirred as she moved toward the bathroom. "Better?" he asked, his voice heavy with the kind of careful optimism reserved for the potentially fragile. "Yes," she lied, because it was easier than explaining that the night had crystallized her resolve rather than eroded it. The storm stopping. She showered methodically, letting the hot water wash away the last vestiges of reasonable hesitation. In the mirror afterward, her reflection looked different somehow, sharper around the edges, as if 68 years of careful composure were finally wearing thin. The letters lay on the bathroom counter where she'd placed them, 3 pieces of paper that had somehow become the most important objects in her world. When she emerged, Harold was already dressed and checking his phone. "Roads should be passable by 8, he announced with visible relief. "We can grab breakfast downstairs and be at the lodge by 9:30. Margaret nodded, but privately, she wondered if she could survive another 3 hours of polite conversation and reasonable planning. The night had burned away something essential in her, perhaps the part that had learned to bury inconvenient truths under layers of propriety and good sense. Breakfast was an ordeal of normalcy. Harold ordered his usual, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, orange juice, and made pleasant conversation with the innkeeper about snow removal and local road conditions. Margaret picked at her oatmeal and smiled at appropriate intervals, but inside she felt like a woman watching her execution being planned with meticulous courtesy. "Your wife seems quiet this morning," the innkeeper observed to Harold, refilling their coffee cups. "Hope she's not coming down with something." "Just tired," Harold replied, shooting Margaret a concerned glance. "We had a long day yesterday." The casual dismissal of her emotional state, their shared assumption that she was simply not functioning at optimal levels, sparked something hot and unfamiliar in Margaret's chest. How many times had her feelings been explained away as fatigue or stress or hormones? How many times had she accepted those explanations herself, grateful for any excuse to avoid the messier truths underneath? After breakfast, they loaded their suitcases into Harold's sedan with the efficiency of a couple who had traveled together for decades. He scraped ice from the windshield while she adjusted the heater settings and arranged their coffee cups in the console holders. The familiar routine should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like participating in her own burial. The drive to the lodge took 40 minutes through a transformed landscape. Snow had softened every harsh edge, turning the mountain road into a tunnel through crystalline silence. Harold drove with his characteristic caution, maintaining steady speed and commenting occasionally on the beauty of their surroundings. Margaret said nothing. The closer they got to the lodge, the more she felt like she was approaching a point of no return, not just geographically but existentially. Whatever she discovered in that attic would change everything, and there would be no going back to the comfortable ignorance of yesterday morning. When they finally pulled into the lodge's snow-covered driveway, Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The building looked different in daylight, less foreboding but somehow more significant. Snow had drifted against the front porch, and icicles hung from the eaves like nature's own Christmas decorations. "Well," Harold said, turning off the engine. "Here we are." Margaret stared at the lodge's dark windows, knowing that somewhere beyond that glass lay hundreds of children's, letters, and the fragments of her own buried past. The smart thing would be to grab a few boxes of the more valuable Christmas decorations, take some photos for the realtor, and leave. They could be home by evening, back to their predictable routines and carefully managed expectations. Instead, she opened the car door and stepped into the crisp mountain air. "Margaret?" Harold called after her as she walked toward the lodge's front door. "Don't you want to discuss our plan first?" She paused with her hand on the door handle, Harold's voice echoing across the snow-muffled silence. A plan. Yes, Harold would want a plan. Systematic, methodical, designed to minimize risk and maximize efficiency. It was how they had approached everything for 42 years, and it had served them well. But the woman who had lived by Harold's careful plans felt like someone Margaret had been impersonating for decades. "I need to see the attic first," she said, without turning around. "Everything else can wait." She pushed open the door and stepped across the threshold, leaving Harold and his reasonable concerns behind in the cold morning air. The lodge's interior felt different in daylight, less haunted, more expectant. Dust motes danced in the pale sunlight streaming through tall windows, illuminating the Christmas decorations that had seemed so ominous in yesterday's shadows. Margaret moved through the main room without stopping, her boots echoing on the hardwood floors as she headed directly for the narrow staircase. Behind her, she heard Harold enter and stamp his feet on the doormat, then pause. "Margaret, wait. Let's at least check the heating first. Make sure the pipes haven't frozen." She was already climbing the stairs. "The pipes are fine, Harold. The furnace is running." She hadn't actually checked, but some instinct told her the lodge was protecting itself, maintaining just enough warmth to preserve its secrets. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Harold muttered, but his footsteps followed hers up the creaking steps. "You're acting like you're in a trance." The second floor felt colder, shadows pooling in doorways that led to empty bedrooms. Margaret pulled down the attic ladder without hesitation, its hinges protesting with metallic shrieks that seemed to echo through the entire building. She climbed into the dusty darkness before Harold could offer to go first, before he could suggest they bring proper lighting or test the floorboards for safety. In the attic's gloom, the boxes of letters waited exactly as she'd left them. But now, kneeling beside them in the pale light filtering through the single grimy window, Margaret noticed something she'd missed yesterday. Some of the boxes were labeled in different handwritings, not just her aunt's careful script, but other hands. Other caretakers, perhaps, who had maintained this archive of childhood wishes across the decades. Jesus Christ, Harold breathed as his head cleared the attic floor. How many letters are there? Thousands. Margaret was already opening the nearest box, her fingers trembling as she sifted through envelopes. Harold, look at the dates. Some of these go back to the 1920s. She heard him moving carefully across the floorboards, his engineer's eye assessing structural integrity even as his attention focused on the impossible scope of what they'd discovered. Margaret, this is significant. This could be historically important. We should contact someone, a museum maybe, or a university. But Margaret was no longer listening. Her fingers had found another envelope addressed in her own childhood handwriting, this one yellowed with age and sealed with a wax star. With shaking hands, she tore it open and unfolded the letter inside. Dear Santa, I wish Daddy would come home for Christmas like he promised. Mommy cries when she thinks I'm sleeping and she burns the dinner because she forgets it's cooking. I've been very good and I haven't asked for any toys this year. Just Daddy. Please. Love, Margaret, age 7. The words hit her like physical blows. She could suddenly smell burning casserole and hear the sound of muffled sobbing through thin walls. But alongside these fragments of recovered memory came something else. The knowledge that this wish, like the others, had somehow been granted. Not immediately, not in the way a 7-year-old would understand, but her father had come home. He'd returned after New Year's with gifts and apologies and promises to do better. Promises he'd kept for exactly 3 months before disappearing again. What does this one say? Harold asked gently, settling beside her despite the dust coating his good jacket. Margaret handed him the letter without speaking. She watched his face change as he read, saw him glance at her with growing alarm. Margaret, this could be anyone. Children often... It's my handwriting, Harold. She pulled out another letter, then another. And it's my story, the one I spent 60 years forgetting. The evidence was overwhelming now. Letter after letter in her careful child's script, chronicling a childhood of abandonment and fear that bore no resemblance to the safe, stable memories she'd carried. Each letter was a wish born from desperation. I wish Daddy would stop yelling. I wish Mommy would stop drinking. I wish someone would notice I exist. And according to the dates, each wish had been answered within the year. This is impossible, Harold said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was an engineer, a man of facts and measurable forces, yet he was holding proof of something that defied rational explanation. Margaret found herself thinking of her mother's sister, her Aunt Eleanor, who had left her this property. Eleanor, who had rarely visited when Margaret was young, who had seemed to watch her with a mixture of sadness and recognition whenever their paths crossed. Harold, she whispered, what if this place is more than just an archive? What if it's active? Before he could respond, they heard footsteps on the stairs below, slow, deliberate, unmistakably human. They froze, listening as someone moved through the lodge's main floor with the confidence of familiarity. Hello, a woman's voice called. I saw your car outside. I'm Emma Chen from the Historical Society. I think we need to talk. Margaret's hand tightened around the letters as the footsteps below grew closer. The voice that had called out carried an authority that made retreat impossible. This wasn't a casual visitor or lost tourist. Harold moved instinctively toward the attic ladder, his protective instincts overriding the morning's growing tension between them. Should we? He began, but Margaret was already folding the letters and tucking them into her sweater. We go down, she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. We face whatever this is. They descended into the lodge's main room to find a woman in her 40s examining the vintage Christmas decorations with professional interest. Emma Chen was small-framed, but carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to uncovering secrets. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and she wore practical boots caked with snow that suggested a long walk through the morning drifts. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I presume." She turned from a particularly elaborate nutcracker display, her expression unreadable. "I've been hoping you'd come." Harold stepped forward, falling automatically into his role as spokesman and protector. "I'm sorry, but how did you know we'd be here? And how did you get onto the property?" "I've been watching the lodge since Eleanor passed." Emma's gaze moved past Harold to settle on Margaret with uncomfortable intensity. "She asked me to keep an eye on things until the family came to claim it, though I suspect she knew exactly which family member would be most affected by what's stored here." Margaret felt the letters crackle against her chest as she moved deeper into the room. "You knew my aunt well?" "For the last 15 years of her life." Emma's tone suggested this was an understatement. She was obsessed with this place, with maintaining what she called the archive. She spent her final years cataloging and preserving every letter, every wish. She said someone would eventually come who needed to understand. The word understand hung between them like a challenge. Margaret was aware of Harold watching her carefully, gauging her reactions, probably calculating how quickly he could get her away from this place if she showed signs of the instability he feared. "Understand what?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew the answer would shatter whatever remained of her carefully constructed sense of reality. Emma walked to the massive stone fireplace and ran her fingers along the mantle's carved surface. "Your aunt discovered something about this lodge in the 1970s. Something that scared her enough to dedicate the rest of her life to documenting it." She paused, seeming to weigh her words. "She said the wishes written here don't just disappear into childhood imagination, they have consequences." Harold made a sound of dismissal. "That's ridiculous. Children write letters to Santa everywhere. It doesn't mean—" "Not everywhere." Emma's voice cut through his protests. "This lodge was built on land that's been significant for centuries. The indigenous people who lived here before white settlement considered it a place where the boundary between wanting and receiving was thin. They had rituals, ceremonies designed to honor that power responsibly." Margaret found herself thinking of the perfect timing of her childhood wishes being granted, her father's returns always just when desperation peaked, her mother's brief periods of sobriety coinciding exactly with Margaret's most heartfelt pleas for normalcy. "You're talking about magic," Harold said flatly. "You're asking us to believe in magic. I'm asking you to consider that some places hold power we don't fully understand." Emma turned back to Margaret. "Your aunt left detailed records. She documented patterns, tracked the children whose letters were stored here, followed up on their adult lives. The correlation between childhood wishes and subsequent life events is statistically impossible to dismiss as coincidence." Margaret felt the room tilt slightly, as if the lodge itself was shifting to accommodate this new reality. "What kind of patterns?" "Children who wished for absent parents often found them returning, but damaged, incomplete. Kids who wished for wealth saw their families come into money through tragedy or loss. Those who wished to be noticed often became the center of unwanted attention." Emma's expression grew grave. "The power here grants wishes, but it doesn't understand context or consequence. It gives exactly what's asked for, without wisdom or compassion." The implications crashed over Margaret like a physical wave. Every childhood wish she discovered, every desperate plea for her father's return or her mother's attention, they'd all been answered, but twisted by a force that operated outside human understanding of what those wishes truly meant. "This is insane," Harold said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was looking at Margaret with growing alarm, as if he could see her slipping away from him in real time. Emma reached into her coat and pulled out a thick folder. "Your aunt left specific instructions. If Margaret Whitmore ever came to claim the lodge, I was to give her this." She held out the folder. "She said you'd need to understand the full scope of what you're dealing with before you make any decisions about this place." Margaret stared at the folder, knowing that accepting it would be crossing a line from which there might be no return. Harold was right to be afraid. She could feel herself changing with each revelation, becoming someone he might not recognize or be able to follow. But the alternative was returning to a life built on buried truths and carefully managed ignorance. She reached for the folder. Margaret's fingers closed around the folder's worn leather surface, and immediately she felt the weight of decades pressing against her palms. The folder was thick with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be maps marked with cryptic notations in her aunt's familiar handwriting. As she opened it, Harold moved closer, his breathing audible in the sudden silence. The first document was a letter addressed to her specifically, dated just 3 months before her aunt's death. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then the lodge has called you back, as I always knew it would. The child who wrote those desperate letters never truly left this place. She has been waiting 70 years for the woman she became to acknowledge what was done to her." Margaret's hands began to shake. She could feel Harold's growing panic beside her, sense Emma watching with the clinical detachment of someone who had witnessed this moment of revelation before. "You must understand. I brought you here as a child. Christmas of 1952, when your father had been gone for 6 months and your mother had stopped pretending to function. You stayed for 2 weeks while she was hospitalized. You were 7 years old, heartbroken, and you wrote letters every night, begging Santa to fix your broken family." The words struck Margaret like physical blows. She could suddenly taste the metallic fear of childhood abandonment, could smell the lodge's particular mixture of pine and dust and something else, something that hummed with possibility and danger. "I don't remember," she whispered, but even as she spoke, fragments were surfacing. A narrow bed in a cold room upstairs, her aunt's gentle voice reading Christmas stories by lamplight, the desperate urgency of wishes that felt like prayers. The power here granted every wish you made, but it interpreted them with the literal mindedness of something inhuman. You wished for your father to come home, and he did, but broken by whatever darkness had driven him away. You wished for your mother to stop being sad, and she did, because the drinking numbed everything, joy and sorrow alike. You wished to be the kind of daughter who could fix everything, and you became someone who spent her entire life trying to repair what was never meant to be her responsibility. Harold's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Margaret, you're crying." She touched her cheek, surprised to find it wet. The folder slipped from her hands, spilling its contents across the dusty floor. Photographs scattered like fallen leaves, images of the lodge through different decades, always filled with children, always maintained with obsessive care. But it was the maps that made her breath catch. They showed the lodge's location marked with symbols she didn't recognize, connected by lines to dozens of other points across New England. Each point was labeled with dates and coordinates, and many bore small photographs of children. Beneath each photo was a single word: granted. "How many?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "How many children has this place affected?" Emma knelt to gather the scattered papers, her movements careful and reverent. "Your aunt documented over 300 cases across 90 years. Some children made small wishes, a toy, a pet, a friend. Those usually turned out well, though not always in expected ways. But others—" She held up a photograph of a girl who couldn't have been more than 5, her eyes filled with adult sorrow. "Others wished for things no child should have to want: safety, food, love from parents who were incapable of giving it." Margaret found herself studying each photograph, recognizing something in their expressions, a particular quality of desperate hope that she remembered feeling but had never understood. These children had all shared her experience of standing at the intersection between innocent faith and cosmic forces too powerful for human comprehension. "Where are they now?" she asked. "The children in these photographs?" Some thrived, despite the complications their wishes created. Others— Emma's expression darkened. Others spent their lives trapped by the very things they thought they wanted. Your aunt tracked them when she could, tried to offer guidance, support. She believed understanding the pattern might help people cope with lives shaped by forces beyond their control. Harold, who had been growing paler with each revelation, finally reached his breaking point. Stop. Just stop. His engineer's mind, trained to solve problems through logic and methodology, was rejecting everything it couldn't quantify. This is mass hysteria, confirmation bias. There are rational explanations for coincidences, for childhood trauma affecting adult behavior. But Margaret was no longer listening to Harold's reasonable protests. She was remembering Christmas morning 1953, returning home from the lodge to find her father waiting with presents and promises, her mother sober and smiling. She remembered believing, with the absolute certainty of childhood, that her letters to Santa had worked magic. She remembered the growing weight of responsibility as each wish was granted in its twisted, incomplete way, and the crushing guilt when nothing she wished for brought the lasting happiness she'd imagined. "The lodge doesn't just grant wishes," she said, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "It traps the wishers. It makes them responsible for everything that follows." Emma nodded gravely. "Your aunt spent 40 years trying to break that connection. She never succeeded. And now it's my turn." Margaret stared at Emma. The words "and now it's my turn" hanging in the air like a challenge she wasn't equipped to meet. The weight of 40 years of failed attempts pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. "How?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How do I break something that's been feeding on children's desperation for nearly a century?" Emma's expression shifted, and for the first time since arriving, she looked uncertain. "Your aunt tried everything. Salt circles, blessing ceremonies, even attempting to burn the letters. Nothing worked. The connection runs deeper than the physical artifacts." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What aren't you telling me?" Eleanor's final theory. Emma hesitated, glancing at Harold, who had gone unnaturally still. She believed the only way to sever the connection was for the original wisher to return and formally renounce their wishes. All of them. But the cost. "What cost?" Harold demanded, his voice sharp with alarm. Emma pulled out another document from the scattered papers, a medical report dated 6 months before Eleanor's death. Margaret caught glimpses of words that made her blood freeze: severe cognitive decline, memory fragmentation, complete dissociation from established identity. "She tried it," Emma said quietly. "Your aunt attempted the renunciation ritual on herself. She'd made wishes here as a child too, you see. The process requires you to fully experience every moment your wishes altered, to feel the weight of every unintended consequence. Eleanor couldn't survive reliving 70 years of interconnected choices and their cascading effects." Margaret sank into one of the lodge's dusty armchairs, her legs no longer able to support her. She went insane. She lost herself entirely. Spent her final months believing she was still 7 years old, waiting for Christmas morning, convinced that if she could just write the perfect letter, everything would be fixed. Harold moved toward Margaret with the careful precision of someone approaching a dangerous precipice. "We're leaving, now. Today, we'll sell this place sight unseen, never come back." But Margaret shook her head slowly. "You don't understand. It doesn't matter if we leave. The connection is already re-established. Being here, finding the letters, learning the truth, I can feel it awakening. The wishes are still active, still shaping everything." As if to prove her point, her phone buzzed with a text message. Harold's contact at the real estate firm, responding to inquiries Harold had never made. "Great news. Found a buyer for your Vermont property. Cash offer well above asking. Can close this week if you're interested." Margaret held up the phone with a trembling hand. "I wished this morning that we could sell quickly and get away from here. The lodge is already granting it." Harold stared at the message, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something approaching terror. "That's coincidence. Market forces. There are logical explanations." "Look around you." Margaret's voice cracked with the strain of revelation. 70 years of logical explanations for why my life unfolded exactly as a desperate 7-year-old wished it would. Meeting you at exactly the right moment when I'd wished for someone stable and kind. Your job transfer to Hartford coming right after I'd unconsciously wished to live somewhere that felt safe. Even your personality, Harold. Your need to fix things, to protect me. It's all part of the pattern." The accusation hung between them like a blade. Harold's face went white as he processed the implications. "You're saying I'm not real," he said, his voice hollow. "That our marriage, Our 43 years together, none of it was genuine. I don't know. Margaret pressed her hands against her temples, feeling the onset of a crushing headache. That's the terrible truth. I can't tell anymore what's authentic and what's manufactured. Maybe you chose to love me, or maybe the lodge twisted circumstance to place you in my path because a lonely child once wished for someone who would never leave her. Emma gathered the scattered documents with quiet efficiency, her movements suggesting she'd witnessed this particular devastation before. The uncertainty is part of how it maintains control. You can never be sure which choices were truly yours. Margaret watched her husband, the man who had been her anchor for 4 decades, step back from her as if she'd become something toxic. The careful distance in his eyes was worse than anger would have been. "I can't do this, Margaret." His voice was steady, but she could hear the fractures beneath. "I can't spend the rest of our lives questioning whether anything we've built together is real. Harold, please." No. He was already moving toward the door, his engineer's mind seeking the clean logic of escape. "I'm going back to Hartford. When you're ready to leave this madness behind, call me." The door slammed with a finality that echoed through the lodge like a death knell. Margaret sat in the sudden silence, surrounded by 70 years of documented wishes and their consequences, watching through the frost-covered window as Harold's car disappeared into the falling snow. She was alone with the truth she'd uncovered, and with the growing certainty that trying to break free from the lodge's influence would destroy whatever remained of her identity. The wishes had already cost her everything that mattered. Now they wanted the rest. Margaret sat motionless in the armchair for what felt like hours after Harold's departure, watching the snow accumulate against the windows like a slow burial. Emma had quietly retreated to the kitchen, leaving her alone with the scattered evidence of her aunt's obsession and her own unraveling life. The silence in the lodge was different now, not peaceful, but expectant, as if the building itself was holding its breath. When she finally moved, it was with the mechanical precision of someone operating beyond emotional capacity. She gathered the photographs and documents from the floor, arranging them in careful stacks on the coffee table. Each image of a child seemed to watch her with knowing eyes, as if they understood what she was only beginning to grasp. The revelation came not as a lightning strike of understanding, but as a slow, inexorable tide of certainty that crept through her consciousness until resistance became impossible. She wasn't the victim of the lodge's power. She was its curator. The truth had been hiding in plain sight among her aunt's meticulously organized records. Eleanor hadn't just been documenting the wishes and their consequences, she'd been managing them, guiding their fulfillment, ensuring the delicate balance between granting and controlling remained intact. The dates on the files weren't random observations but careful interventions, moments when Eleanor had nudged circumstance to align with the lodge's ancient purpose. Margaret found her aunt's journal buried beneath the medical reports, its pages filled with entries that read like a supernatural accountant's ledger. Tommy Morrison Wish, dated 12/23/47. Father returned from war, but with severe PTSD. Arranged job at local mill through contact with supervisor. Family stable but fragile. Monitor quarterly. Susan Chen, wish dated December 15, 2055. Wished for baby brother. Parents had given up trying. Introduced mother to new fertility specialist in Boston through Women's Auxiliary. Michael born September 12, 2056. Healthy outcome. Page after page revealed the same pattern, Eleanor identifying children whose wishes had been granted, then spending decades carefully managing the consequences, smoothing the rough edges of cosmic intervention with human engineering. She hadn't been trying to break the lodge's power. She'd been its earthly administrator, ensuring the magic remained functional without destroying the lives it touched. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached the journal's final entry. Dated just days before Eleanor's death, Margaret's return is inevitable. The lodge will call her when I can no longer serve. She has the strongest connection of any child who ever wished here. 7 different letters, 7 granted wishes, all interconnected. She'll resist at first, but she'll understand eventually. The responsibility chooses its own bearers. The understanding that crashed over Margaret was so complete, so devastating, that for a moment she couldn't breathe. Every seemingly coincidental meeting that had shaped her life, every perfectly timed opportunity, every moment of unexpected grace, none of it had been natural occurrence. Eleanor had been orchestrating it all, guiding Margaret's path with the same meticulous care she'd shown every other child whose wishes had been granted. Harold's job transfer to Hartford hadn't been random corporate reassignment. Eleanor had written a letter of recommendation to the engineering firm, mentioning Margaret's need for stability after her mother's death. Their house in the quiet suburb hadn't been a lucky find. Eleanor had quietly encouraged the previous owners to sell when she learned Margaret was looking. Even their inability to have children, which had caused Margaret such grief in her 30s, had been carefully managed. Eleanor's journal revealed several accidental encounters with adoption counselors that Margaret had politely declined, never realizing they were orchestrated interventions. "She protected me," Margaret whispered to the empty room, "from everything, even from understanding what I was." Emma appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee that smelled like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. "You found it," she said simply. "Eleanor's real journal. You knew. I helped her with some of the arrangements over the years. The lodge requires a human intermediary to function smoothly, someone to ensure the granted wishes don't spiral into complete chaos." Emma set down the coffee and settled into the chair across from Margaret. "The power here is ancient and alien. It understands desire but not wisdom. Without someone to guide the outcomes, most wishes would destroy the wishers." Margaret stared at the journal, seeing her entire life reframed through the lens of supernatural social work. And now she's gone. The wishes are still being granted, but without management. Children are still writing letters. Not just here, but anywhere their desperate hope is strong enough to connect with this place. The consequences are becoming more chaotic, more harmful. Emma's voice carried the weight of witnessed suffering. In the past 6 months, 3 children whose wishes were granted without Eleanor's guidance have experienced what you might call catastrophic fulfillment. The responsibility settled on Margaret's shoulders like a physical weight. She understood now why Eleanor had never tried to destroy the lodge. Not because she couldn't, but because she'd recognized the necessity of its function. Children would always make desperate wishes, would always need their impossible hopes to occasionally come true. The question wasn't whether the magic should exist, but whether it would be wielded with compassion. Margaret looked up at Emma, seeing not the stranger she'd assumed but a partner who had been waiting decades for this conversation. "You're going to help me, aren't you? The way you helped her." Emma nodded. "If you'll accept the role, the lodge has already chosen you. The only question is whether you'll choose it back." Outside, the snow continued falling, blanketing the lodge in pristine silence. Margaret thought of Harold driving through the storm, convinced he was escaping madness, not knowing he was simply playing his part in a story that had been written long before he was born. She opened the journal to a fresh page and began to write. December 15th, M. Whitmore, assuming custodial responsibilities. Current active wishes requiring intervention, 23 documented cases, estimated 12 to 15 additional unmonitored. Priority assessment needed. Margaret's hand moved across the page with surprising steadiness, the words flowing as if she'd been writing such entries her entire life. Perhaps, in a way, she had been. Every act of kindness, every moment of intuitive help she'd offered throughout her career as a school counselor had been preparation for this larger purpose. "Tell me about the 3 children," she said without looking up from the journal. "The ones who've suffered from unguided wishes." Emma pulled a manila folder from the stack of documents, her expression grave. 8-year-old Timothy Brooks in Portland wished for his parents to stop fighting. They did. His father simply disappeared one morning, leaving no trace, the mother's having a complete breakdown. Timothy blames himself. She passed Margaret a photograph of a boy with hollow eyes that held too much guilt for his age. Jenny Martinez in Burlington wished her grandmother would get better instead of dying from cancer. Emma's voice grew quieter. The cancer disappeared overnight, completely. But something else came back in her grandmother's body. Something that looks like her and sounds like her, but isn't. The family knows, but they're too afraid to admit it. Margaret felt ice forming in her stomach. And the third? David Chen, no relation to Susan from the 50s. He wished his baby sister would stop crying because it was making his mother sad. Emma hesitated. The baby stopped. Permanently. She's alive, but she's silent. No sounds at all. The doctors can't find anything wrong, but she just stares at everything with this ancient awareness that no infant should have. The pen trembled in Margaret's hand as she absorbed the implications. These weren't the manageable complications her aunt had spent decades smoothing over. These were fundamental violations of natural order, wishes granted with mechanical precision, but without the tempering influence of human wisdom. "How do we fix this?" Margaret asked. "Carefully," Emma replied. Eleanor's methods took years to develop. She learned to work within the wish's existing structure rather than fighting them directly. Timothy's situation might be salvageable. His father could be found and guided back, perhaps with therapeutic support to address the family's underlying issues. But the others, Margaret understood. Some consequences were too profound to unravel without risking worse damage. The grandmother who wasn't quite herself, the silent baby with adult eyes, these were transformations that might be permanent. Eleanor would have focused on supporting the families while preventing similar occurrences. "Show me the active cases," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength. "The ones we might still influence." Emma spread out a map marked with colored pins, red for crisis situations, yellow for developing concerns, green for stable but monitored cases. The pattern revealed itself immediately. A rough circle centered on the lodge, extending across 3 states, with concentration points near major cities where children's desperation reached sufficient intensity to bridge the geographical gap. "Here," Emma pointed to a red pin in Albany. "Melissa Santos, age 9. Parents are getting divorced, fighting for custody. She wrote to Santa 3 days ago asking for her family to be fixed forever. The wish is building energy. We probably have 48 hours before it manifests." Margaret studied the case file. Father with gambling addiction, mother working 3 jobs to pay debts, Melissa caught between them and blaming herself for their problems. The kind of desperate family situation that could spiral into nightmare territory if the lodge granted the girl's wish with its typical literal-minded approach. What would Eleanor have done? Intervened before the manifestation. A carefully timed phone call to the mother about a debt counseling service. Anonymous tip to the father's employer about an employee assistance program. Small nudges to create space for actual healing instead of magical quick fixes. Margaret felt something settling into place inside her chest. Not resignation, but recognition. This was work she understood, just on a scale she'd never imagined. Every difficult family she'd counseled, every child she'd helped navigate impossible circumstances had been training for this moment. "I'll need access to resources," she said, already planning. Phone numbers, contacts, ways to reach these families without raising suspicion. Emma smiled for the first time since arriving, the expression transforming her weathered face. Eleanor left detailed networks in place. Counselors, social workers, teachers, clergy. People positioned to offer help when needed, most of them unaware they're part of a larger system. Margaret began making lists, her mind organizing the overwhelming responsibility into manageable tasks. Check on the 3 crisis cases first. Assess the active wishes for intervention opportunities. Review Eleanor's contact networks. Establish communication protocols with Emma for ongoing cases. The work felt enormous, but no longer impossible. She had knowledge, experience, and a partner who understood the scope of what they were attempting. Most importantly, she had purpose. Clear, urgent, and completely her own choice. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, late afternoon sunlight breaking through the clouds to illuminate the snow-covered grounds. Margaret looked up from her planning to see the lodge transformed, no longer a trap but a sanctuary where children's hope could be honored without destroying them. She picked up her phone and, after a moment's hesitation, typed a message to Harold. "I'm staying. Not because I have to, but because I choose to. This is who I'm meant to be." The reply came 3 hours later, after Margaret and Emma had made their first intervention call to a debt counseling service in Albany. Harold's response was exactly what she'd expected, and somehow still devastating. In its finality, "I can't watch you disappear into this madness. I'll have divorce papers drawn up after the holidays. I'm sorry." Margaret stared at the message until the words blurred, then set the phone aside and returned to Eleanor's contact lists. The pain was immediate and sharp, but underneath it lay something she hadn't anticipated: relief. The pretense was over. No more explaining herself to someone who would never understand. No more watching Harold's face close off every time she mentioned the lodge's reality. "He'll come around," Emma said gently from across the table where she was organizing case files. "No, he won't." Margaret's voice was steady, surprising them both. "And that's not his fault. I'm asking him to accept that his entire marriage was orchestrated by forces he can't comprehend. That every major decision we made together might have been influenced by my childhood wishes. What rational person could live with that uncertainty?" The admission hurt, but it also clarified something essential. Margaret had spent the past week trying to preserve a life that was already lost the moment she'd opened that first letter in the attic. Harold was right to run. She would have done the same thing a week ago. Emma pulled out a thick binder labeled Emergency Protocols and opened it to a section marked with Eleanor's precise handwriting: "When wishes manifest without guidance. Immediate response procedures." "Melissa Santos," Emma said, returning their focus to the crisis cases. "The wish energy is building faster than we anticipated. The family situation deteriorated this afternoon. Father lost another 1,000 at the casino. Mother filed a restraining order. Melissa's desperation is intensifying the magical resonance." Margaret felt something shift in her awareness, like a frequency being tuned in on an old radio. For just a moment, she could sense it, a desperate 9-year-old's anguish reaching across the miles, connecting to the ancient power that slept beneath the lodge. The sensation was overwhelming, raw emotion amplified beyond human capacity to bear. "I can feel her," Margaret whispered, pressing her hands against her temples. "How is that possible?" "The lodge bonds with its curator." Eleanor could sense every child whose wish was building toward manifestation. It nearly drove her insane the first year, but she learned to filter the input, focus only on the critical cases. The ability was both gift and curse. Margaret could perceive the exact moment when intervention was needed, but she'd also experience every child's pain as if it were her own. She understood now why Eleanor had looked so haunted in her later photographs, why she'd never married or had children of her own. How could you love someone completely when your heart was already stretched across dozens of desperate families? Another wave of sensation hit her. David Chen's baby sister, the silent child with ancient eyes, radiating an otherworldly awareness that made Margaret's skin crawl. Then Timothy Brooks, the boy whose father had vanished, his guilt and confusion creating ripples of distortion in the magical field. The unguided wishes were like infected wounds in the fabric of reality, poisoning everything around them. "We have to fix this," Margaret said, reaching for the phone. "All of it. Not just the new cases, but the ones that have already gone wrong." Emma caught her wrist, gently but firmly. "Margaret, listen to me. Eleanor spent 40 years learning to manage this responsibility, and it nearly destroyed her. You can't heal 70 years of magical consequences in a single night." But Margaret was already moving. Eleanor's contact network spreading through her mind like a map of possibility. The school counselor who could arrange a psychological evaluation for Timothy's mother. The pediatric specialist who might find a way to help David's sister. The family therapist with experience in unusual cases who could support the Martinez family through their grandmother's transformation. The work would take months, maybe years. Some damage might be irreversible. But for the first time since discovering the letters in the attic, Margaret felt truly herself. Not the victim of supernatural manipulation, but its conscious director. Her phone buzzed with another message from Harold. "Please come home. We can work through this together." Margaret looked at the words for a long moment, then deleted the message without responding. Home wasn't a place she could return to anymore. Home was here, in this snowbound lodge, surrounded by the hopes and fears of children who needed someone to ensure their desperate wishes didn't destroy them. Outside, full darkness had fallen, but the snow continued to catch and reflect the lodge's warm lights. Emma was right. The building looked different now, no longer a prison but a lighthouse, marking safe harbor for dreams too dangerous to grant without guidance. Margaret opened Eleanor's journal to a fresh page and began planning their next intervention. The real work was just beginning, and she finally understood she'd been preparing for it her entire life. Margaret had been writing intervention strategies for less than an hour when the lodge itself began to shake. At first, she thought it was the wind. The storm outside had been building all evening, and the old Victorian structure creaked constantly. But this was different. The tremor came from below, as if the mountain's bedrock was shifting. The vintage Christmas ornaments hanging throughout the room swayed in perfect unison, their gentle chiming creating an almost musical resonance. Emma looked up from her files, face pale. "Something's wrong." Before Margaret could ask what she meant, the sensation hit her like a physical blow. Every active wish across the 3-state radius was resonating at once, dozens of desperate children's hopes crashing together in a crescendo of need that made her double over in pain. The psychic feedback was so intense she could taste copper in her mouth. "The balance is collapsing," Emma said, rushing to the window. "Without Eleanor's active management for 6 months, the magical infrastructure is destabilizing. The wishes are trying to fulfill themselves all at once." Margaret forced herself upright, though the psychic pressure made her vision blur. Through her supernatural awareness, she could feel each crisis amplifying the others. Melissa Santos in Albany, whose family's dysfunction was spiraling toward violence. A new case in Burlington, where 10-year-old Marcus had wished his abusive stepfather would disappear forever. Twins in Manchester, whose dying mother had promised them a miracle Christmas that was now manifesting as something monstrous. "How do we stop it?" Margaret gasped. "You have to choose," Emma said, her voice cutting through the chaos. Eleanor faced this same test 43 years ago when she first took control. The lodge won't accept divided attention. You can try to save everyone and lose them all, or you can prioritize and save who you can. The knowledge hit Margaret with terrible clarity. This was why Eleanor's journal contained so many entries about acceptable losses and strategic triage. The curator's role wasn't to be a supernatural savior, but a battlefield medic making impossible choices about who deserved salvation first. Another tremor shook the building, and Margaret felt the ancient power beneath the lodge stirring like a waking giant. If she didn't act soon, the accumulated magical energy would discharge randomly, granting every pending wish with catastrophic literalness. Fathers would vanish into nothingness. Miracles would come wrapped in horror. Children's innocent hopes would become their family's destruction. Margaret spread Eleanor's contact lists across the table, her hands shaking as she cross-referenced crisis levels with available resources. The math was brutal, 23 active cases requiring immediate intervention, but realistically, she could only manage coordinated help for 6, maybe 8 families before the magical cascade became unstoppable. "The twins in Manchester," she said, grabbing the phone. "Their mother's dying wish is the strongest resonance. If that one goes wrong, it'll destabilize everything else." Emma nodded grimly, already pulling the relevant files. The case was heartbreaking. Sarah and Michael Connolly, age 8, whose mother had promised them one perfect Christmas before the cancer took her. She died 2 days ago, but the children's absolute faith in her promise was manifesting as something that looked like their mother but smelled like grave earth. Margaret dialed the emergency contact for the children's temporary guardian while simultaneously reaching out with her newfound supernatural senses, trying to contain the magical buildup through sheer force of will. The effort felt like trying to dam a river with her bare hands. "Mrs. Patterson? This is Margaret Whitmore from the Emergency Family Services Network. I need you to take Sarah and Michael to the hospital immediately. Tell them it's a suspected gas leak in your home, anything to get them away from their mother." The confusion in the woman's voice was audible. "But Margaret, their mother passed away Monday. We're planning the funeral for—" "Mrs. Patterson, trust me. Get the children out of that house right now." While Margaret coordinated the emergency response for Manchester, Emma was on her own phone, working through the Albany situation with military precision. Margaret could feel Melissa Santos's wish building toward critical mass. The 9-year-old's desperate desire to fix her family was about to manifest as something that would permanently alter her parents' personalities, turning them into loving but hollow versions of themselves. The lodge shuddered again, and Margaret realized with growing horror that the magical discharge was beginning whether she was ready or not. Somewhere in Vermont, Timothy Brooks was about to get his father back. But the man who returned would have been fundamentally changed by his journey through whatever space existed between worlds. In Burlington, the grandmother, who wasn't quite herself, was beginning to remember what she had been before the cancer, and her growing awareness was terrifying the family who'd welcomed her return. Margaret closed her eyes and reached deep into the connection she'd inherited from Eleanor, feeling the vast network of wishes and consequences spreading out like a web with the lodge at its center. This was her final test, not just accepting the responsibility, but proving she could wield it under the worst possible circumstances. Everything she'd learned, every insight from Eleanor's journals, every instinct developed through years of counseling families in crisis, had been preparation for this moment. The choices would define not just her own future, but the fate of every desperate child whose hope had reached across the darkness to find this place. The lodge's trembling reached a crescendo, and Margaret knew she had seconds before the magical cascade became irreversible. The psychic pressure felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. Dozens of children's desperate wishes swirling around her, each one demanding immediate attention, each one threatening to tear reality apart if left unguided. But there was something else in the storm now. Something Margaret had felt building since she'd first touched those impossible letters in the attic. A presence, ancient, patient, and utterly alien to human understanding. "Emma," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the supernatural wind that was beginning to howl through the lodge's corridors. What did Eleanor's journal say about the original force, the thing that grants the wishes? Emma's face went white. She called it the listener. She thought it wasn't malevolent exactly, but it doesn't understand human complexity. It hears the wishes literally, grants them without comprehension of consequence. The building shook so violently that ornaments began falling from the Christmas trees, shattering on the hardwood floor in crystalline explosions. Margaret felt her awareness expanding beyond the immediate crises, touching something vast and incomprehensible that dwelt in the spaces between thought and reality. "You would be curator," came a voice that wasn't quite a voice, more like an idea pressed directly into her consciousness. "But you resist the necessary choices." Margaret found herself standing in a place that wasn't quite the lodge's main room. The furniture remained, but the walls had become translucent, revealing a starless void beyond. Emma was frozen mid-motion, phone still pressed to her ear, caught in a moment between seconds. "Show yourself," Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The presence coalesced slowly, taking a form that her human perception could almost grasp. Tall, indefinably shaped, with eyes like distant galaxies. It radiated the patient indifference of geological time, the absolute neutrality of natural law. "I am what remains of hope deferred," it said. "I am the answer to prayers spoken into darkness. For 7 decades, Eleanor taught me restraint, showed me the harm in literal fulfillment. But Eleanor is gone, and the accumulated wishes must be honored." "Not like this," Margaret said, feeling the weight of every pending crisis pressing against her consciousness. "The children don't understand what they're asking for." "Children ask. I answer." The curator's role is to guide the form of that answer, not to prevent it. Margaret felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. This wasn't a battle she could win through confrontation. The listener wasn't evil, it was something far more dangerous. It was absolute compassion without wisdom, unlimited power without comprehension of the human heart's contradictions. "Then let me guide them," she said. "All of them. Give me the power to reach every child whose wish is building toward manifestation." The presence tilted its impossible head. Such power would destroy your human mind within hours. Eleanor learned this gradually, over decades. You ask for the full burden at once? Maybe, Margaret said, thinking of Harold's departing car, of the life she'd already lost, of the woman she'd been before discovering her true purpose. But maybe that's what this requires. Not someone trying to preserve their old existence while managing the new responsibility. Someone willing to become whatever the role demands. The listener moved closer, and Margaret felt the full weight of its attention like standing beneath an infinite sky. You would sacrifice your humanity for the sake of these unknown children? The answer came without hesitation. I would expand it. Something shifted in the void around them. Margaret felt power flowing into her. Not the overwhelming flood that would have shattered her consciousness, but a precise connection to each active case across the 3-state radius. She could feel Melissa Santos's terror as her father raised his hand in anger, could sense the twins in Manchester watching something that wore their mother's face shamble through their temporary guardian's kitchen. But more importantly, she could feel the threads of possibility connecting each crisis to its potential resolution. The social worker driving through the storm toward Melissa's house. The pediatric specialist in Burlington, who'd spent her career studying unusual psychological cases. The grief counselor in Manchester, who understood how children's magical thinking could become dangerous denial. I can do this, Margaret whispered, her awareness splitting across dozens of simultaneous interventions. She was guiding phone calls, arranging coincidental meetings, nudging the right people toward the right places at precisely the right moments. Each action required split-second timing and absolute precision, but for the first time since entering the lodge, Margaret felt completely, perfectly herself. The listener watched her work with something approaching approval. You begin to understand. The curator does not fight the wishes. She weaves them into patterns that honor hope without destroying the hopeful. Margaret nodded, too focused on her expanding network of interventions to speak. She was becoming something new. Not quite human anymore, but not lost to inhumanity either. She was becoming the bridge between children's impossible dreams and the possible world, the translator who could speak fluently in both languages of desperation and healing. The lodge settled into stillness around them, no longer shaking but thrumming with contained power. The confrontation was ending not with victory or defeat, but with transformation. The transformation should have felt like triumph, but as Margaret's awareness stabilized across the network of interventions, the true cost of her victory began to crystallize. Each successful coordination, the social worker arriving at precisely the right moment, the grief counselor's phone ringing just as the twins' guardian reached her breaking point, required something from her that she could feel slipping away like sand through her fingers. Now you understand, the listener said, its presence already beginning to fade back into the spaces between reality. Each wish guided to safe harbor requires a fragment of the curator's former self as anchor. Eleanor gave pieces of her humanity for 40 years until little remained but purpose. Margaret felt it happening, memories growing distant and abstract, as if they belonged to someone she'd once known rather than lived herself. Her first dance with Harold at their college mixer became factual rather than felt, the emotional resonance draining away to make room for Timothy Brooks's desperate need for his father's return. The morning she discovered she was pregnant with the child they'd lost became clinical knowledge as she channeled that space toward helping the pediatric specialist understand the unnatural stillness in David Chen's baby sister. No, she whispered, trying to hold on to the sensation of Harold's hand in hers on their wedding day. But the memory was already becoming gossamer, dissolving to provide psychic energy for a midnight intervention in Burlington where Marcus's stepfather was about to discover that some wishes came with teeth. The lodge's main room materialized fully around her again. Emma stood frozen for one more heartbeat before time resumed its normal flow, her phone conversation continuing seamlessly with the Albany Emergency Services. But when Emma's eyes met Margaret's across the room, her expression shifted to something between awe and horror. Your eyes, Emma said softly. They're different now. Older. Like Eleanor's were in her final photographs. Margaret moved to the antique mirror above the mantelpiece and saw what Emma meant. The face looking back was still hers, but the eyes held depths that belonged to someone who had seen too much, felt too much, sacrificed too much. They were the eyes of someone who loved humanity enough to step outside it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Harold, stopped for gas in White River Junction. "Last chance. Tell me you're coming home with me, and I'll turn around." Margaret stared at the message, trying to summon the emotion that should have accompanied it. She knew intellectually that she loved Harold, could recite the facts of their decades together like historical data. But the feeling itself had become fuel for her expanding network of interventions, burned away to power the delicate psychic surgery required to guide 23 children's wishes toward safe resolution. She typed back, "I am home. Take care of yourself, Harold. You deserve better than what I could give you now." Deleting his contact information felt like the final severance. She was becoming something that could love all children simultaneously, but could no longer love any individual completely. The price of saving everyone was losing the capacity for personal attachment. Eleanor's journals had hinted at this truth, but experiencing it was devastating in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. "How long do I have?" she asked Emma, her voice steady despite the internal upheaval. Before the complete transformation, Eleanor maintained fragments of herself for nearly 2 decades, but she started the transition gradually. Emma's clinical tone couldn't quite mask her grief. "You've accepted the full burden at once, maybe months, maybe weeks." Through her supernatural awareness, Margaret felt the immediate crises beginning to stabilize. The social worker was convincing Melissa's parents to enter family counseling. The grief counselor had arrived at the twins' location and was gently explaining how sometimes love makes us see impossible things. The pediatric specialist was scheduling a comprehensive evaluation for David's sister that would reveal the delicate process needed to help an ancient consciousness learn to be human again. Each successful intervention cost her another piece of her former identity, but Margaret found she could bear the price. What she was becoming might be less than human in some ways, but it was also more, a guardian standing at the intersection of hope and reality, ensuring that neither destroyed the other. "Will you stay?" she asked Emma. "To help coordinate the network until the transition is complete?" Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Eleanor asked me the same thing 40 years ago. I said yes then, too." Margaret moved to Eleanor's desk and opened the journal to begin documenting the new protocols they'd need for the expanded operation. Her handwriting was already changing, becoming more precise and less personal, like Eleanor's had in her final entries. Outside, the storm was breaking. The first pale light of dawn touched the snow-covered mountains, and Margaret could feel dozens of children waking to discover their nightmares had passed, their desperate wishes transformed into manageable reality through her intervention. The sacrifice was complete, the victory was absolute, and Margaret Whitmore, curator of Impossible Dreams, began the work of becoming something larger than herself. The first week after the transformation passed like a dream remembered through thick glass. Margaret moved through the lodge with mechanical precision, documenting cases and coordinating interventions with an efficiency that would have impressed her former self, if her former self still existed in any meaningful way. The woman who had arrived 3 weeks ago, terrified, confused, clinging desperately to a marriage that was already dissolving, felt like a character from a half-remembered novel. Harold called twice. Both times, Margaret let it ring, watching his name appear on the screen with the detached interest of an anthropologist observing human behavior. She knew she should feel something: guilt, longing, regret, but those emotions had been among the first casualties of her expanded consciousness. They were too personal, too limiting for someone whose heart now encompassed hundreds of children across 3 states. Emma found her standing in the attic on a Tuesday morning, staring at the trunk where she'd first discovered the impossible letters. The handwriting that had once seemed so mysteriously familiar now appeared almost foreign, the desperate scrawl of someone who still believed in the luxury of personal wants. "The Patterson twins are settling into their new living arrangement," Emma reported, consulting her tablet. "The grief counselor says they've stopped asking about their mother's visits. And the Burlington case has been resolved. David's sister is responding well to the specialized care. Margaret nodded without turning around. What about the new manifestations? I can feel 3 building toward critical mass, but the details are still unclear. 2 in Massachusetts, 1 in New Hampshire, all involving parental abandonment wishes. We should be able to coordinate standard intervention protocols. Emma hesitated. Margaret, when's the last time you ate something? The question struck Margaret as oddly irrelevant. Food was fuel for a biological system she was rapidly outgrowing. I'm sustained by the network now. Eleanor's final journals mentioned the same transition, decreased need for physical maintenance as supernatural connection deepens. Emma's reflection appeared in the dusty attic window, her expression torn between professional fascination and personal grief. You're changing faster than she did. The complete personality integration she underwent took years. You're processing decades of accumulated wishes in weeks. The children couldn't wait for gradual adjustment. Margaret's voice carried the patient certainty of someone who had moved beyond doubt. Every moment of delay risked catastrophic manifestations. This was the only way. She could feel Emma's struggle, the desire to mourn what Margaret had lost warring with admiration for what she had gained. It was becoming difficult to relate to such internal conflict. The clarity of purpose Margaret now possessed made emotional ambivalence seem like an elaborate luxury she could barely remember enjoying. A new presence touched the edge of her awareness, small and desperate, and radiating the particular frequency of a child who had moved beyond hope into magical thinking. Somewhere in western Massachusetts, a 7-year-old named Carlos was making a wish so dangerous it made Margaret's consciousness recoil. Emergency intervention required, she said, already moving toward Eleanor's desk. Carlos Mendez, Springfield area. His father left 6 months ago, but Carlos has convinced himself that if he wishes hard enough on Christmas Eve, his father will return permanently changed, loving, sober, safe. The magical resonance is building toward a manifestation that would bring back something wearing his father's face, but fundamentally altered. Emma was already pulling files, her movements sharp with practiced urgency. What's our intervention window? Margaret extended her supernatural senses, feeling the wish's trajectory like a storm system building on the horizon. 48 hours, maybe less. The intensity of his belief is extraordinary. It's creating feedback loops with other abandonment-related wishes in the region. As they worked through the night, coordinating social workers, arranging coincidental encounters, nudging the right people toward the right revelations at precisely the right moments, Margaret felt another layer of her former humanity slip away. The satisfaction of helping Carlos find safety came without the warm glow of personal accomplishment she once would have experienced. Instead, it felt like the natural functioning of a system operating exactly as designed. By dawn, the immediate crisis had passed. Carlos would wake to find his aunt making breakfast, having arrived for an unexpected visit with news of a job opportunity that would let him live with her permanently. The dangerous wish would dissolve into relief and new hope, guided away from supernatural manifestation toward human possibility. Margaret stood at the lodge's front windows, watching the morning light paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and pink. The view was objectively beautiful, and she could appreciate its aesthetic qualities with perfect clarity. But the emotional response that once would have accompanied such beauty, the catch in her breath, the sense of wonder, had been transformed into fuel for her expanding network of care. She was becoming something unprecedented, a being capable of loving all children everywhere while losing the capacity for the specific, limited, gloriously human love she had once shared with Harold. The irony wasn't lost on her. In gaining the power to answer desperate prayers, she had sacrificed her ability to make them. But as another child's wish touched the edges of her consciousness, tentative, hopeful, heartbreaking in its simple faith, Margaret found she could live with that bargain. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted Margaret's communion with the morning light. She turned from the window with movements that had become economical, precise, drained of the unconscious grace that had once characterized her gestures. A familiar blue sedan was making its way up the lodge's winding drive, moving carefully through the patches of ice that Emma had been meaning to salt. Harold, Margaret felt Emma's presence behind her, radiating concern. "Do you want me to—" "No." Margaret's voice carried the flat certainty that had replaced all her old uncertainties. This was always going to happen. Through the network of her expanded consciousness, she could feel three children's wishes pulsing like distant heartbeats. A girl in New Hampshire hoping her grandmother's cancer would disappear, twins in western Massachusetts convinced their father would return if they were good enough, and somewhere closer, a boy whose Christmas morning terror was building towards something that would require delicate intervention. But Harold's approach demanded her immediate, undivided attention in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to summon. He climbed the front steps slowly, favoring his left knee the way he did when the weather turned cold. Such human frailty seemed almost exotic now to Margaret's transformed perception. She opened the door before he could knock. "Hello, Harold." He stopped on the threshold, studying her face with the methodical attention of a man trying to identify a stranger wearing his wife's features. Margaret. The word carried 42 years of shared history, but it landed in her consciousness like a stone dropped into deep water, creating ripples before disappearing into depths that no longer responded to personal attachment. "You look," he struggled for words, "different. More like Eleanor in those final photographs Emma showed us." Margaret stepped aside to let him enter. "I am different. Come in, we should talk." The lodge's main room felt smaller with Harold in it, as if his presence reminded the space of its original purpose as a place for human gatherings rather than supernatural coordination. He moved to the familiar chair by the fireplace, settling into it with the careful movements of someone trying to make himself comfortable in territory that was no longer quite home. "I've been calling," he said. "I know. I'm sorry I didn't answer. It's become difficult to maintain personal connections while managing the network." Harold flinched at the clinical tone in her voice. "The network. Is that what we're calling it now?" Margaret arranged herself in Eleanor's chair, her posture reflecting the same detached authority she'd observed in her predecessor's final years. 347 children across Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts are currently experiencing various stages of magical thinking that could manifest as supernatural intervention. I coordinate the guidance of their wishes towards safe, natural resolution. The work requires focus, and our marriage? What does that require? The question should have pierced her, should have awakened some echo of the love that had sustained through 4 decades of shared life. Instead, Margaret found herself analyzing Harold's expression with the same dispassionate accuracy she brought to assessing children's psychological states. "Our marriage was built on the assumption that I was the woman you met in college. That person no longer exists in any meaningful sense." She paused as a distant crisis demanded brief attention, the boy whose Christmas terror was spiking toward dangerous levels. 2 seconds of psychic intervention guided a neighbor's concern into action. "I've become something that can love humanity in the abstract but struggles to maintain specific attachments." Harold leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "But you're still you underneath. Margaret, what we had—" "What we had was beautiful," Margaret interrupted, and for a moment something almost like warmth flickered in her voice. "I can acknowledge that intellectually. I can remember the facts of our happiness, but I can no longer feel it the way you need me to feel it." She gestured toward the windows, where morning light revealed the mountains in crystalline detail. "I see that view and appreciate its objective beauty. I remember standing here 3 weeks ago and feeling wonder, joy, the desire to share the moment with you. But those emotions have been repurposed. They're part of what powers my ability to intervene in children's crises." Harold was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. When he looked up, his eyes held the careful steadiness of a man who had spent weeks preparing for heartbreak. "So this is goodbye. This is acknowledgement of what's already happened," Margaret corrected gently. "The woman you married made her final choice when she accepted the full responsibility of the curator's role. What sits before you now is what grew from that choice." Harold stood slowly, moving to the mantelpiece where their photograph still sat among Eleanor's personal effects. "Will you be happy? Can someone like you even be happy anymore?" Margaret considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. Happiness, as I used to experience it, requires the capacity for personal satisfaction. What I have now is purpose. It's deeper than happiness and infinitely more solitary. Harold nodded and moved toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back once more. "I'll always love who you were." "I know," Margaret said. "And she loved you too." After his car disappeared down the mountain road, Margaret returned to Eleanor's desk to continue documenting the protocols that would guide her successor whenever that distant day arrived. The work welcomed her back with the embrace of absolute necessity. She was home. 3 months later, Margaret moved through the lodge with the fluid economy of someone who had transcended the need for conscious thought about daily routines. The building itself had adapted to her presence, its Victorian bones settling into rhythms that matched the supernatural network she had become. Where drafts once whistled through loose window panes, warm air now circulated with impossible efficiency. The ancient heating system hummed with quiet contentment, as if the lodge itself understood its role as sanctuary. Emma found her in the attic on a Tuesday morning, surrounded by towers of correspondence that seemed to sort themselves. Letters from children arrived now through channels that bypassed conventional mail, wishes spoken into pillows, pleas whispered to bedroom windows, desperate hopes carved into tree bark finding their way to her awareness like homing birds returning to roost. "The Anderson case resolved overnight," Emma reported, settling into the chair they'd moved up here for their daily briefings. "Little Amy's father found the courage to enter rehab after that coincidental encounter with his old sponsor. And the Thompson twins stopped asking why their mother left. The school counselor says they're responding well to the new narrative about sometimes loving someone, meaning letting them find peace." Margaret nodded, her attention simultaneously present and scattered across dozens of developing situations. In Hartford, a boy named Marcus was building toward a dangerous wish about bringing his grandfather back from the dead. In Burlington, twin sisters were convincing themselves they could trade places with their parents' marriage, if they wished hard enough on Christmas morning. "I can feel the seasonal intensification beginning," Margaret said, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there in her human life. "The week before Christmas always brings the most desperate wishes. Children who've maintained hope all year reach the breaking point when they realize magic hasn't saved them yet." Emma studied her friend's transformed face, searching for traces of the woman who had arrived here terrified and confused months ago. Margaret's features had settled into an expression of serene authority that was beautiful and terrible in its completeness. She looked ageless now, suspended between the elderly woman she had been and something altogether other. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked quietly. "The choice you made?" Margaret turned toward the attic window, where winter light painted the mountains in shades of silver and blue. The question touched something deep in her consciousness, a place where echoes of her former self still whispered. "Regret implies the existence of alternatives," she said finally. "But I understand now that there never were any real alternatives. Eleanor knew when she left me those letters. She knew I would find them exactly when the network needed a new curator. Every choice that led me here, marrying Harold, the career that ended in disappointment, even the estrangement from my aunt, was preparation for this moment." A new crisis pulsed at the edge of her awareness, urgent and heartbreaking. Somewhere in western Massachusetts, a little girl named Sophia was making a wish so pure and devastating that it threatened to tear holes in the fabric between hope and reality. Margaret closed her eyes, extending her consciousness toward the child's desperate prayer. Sophia wanted her baby brother to be born healthy, but more than that, she wanted him to be born perfect, incapable of suffering, immune to all the pain she'd witnessed in her short life. The wish was building toward a manifestation that would create something beautiful and terrible, a being of such supernatural perfection that it couldn't survive in the human world. Working with the delicate precision of a surgeon, Margaret began the complex process of guiding Sophia's wish toward a gentler resolution. A chance encounter with a nurse who specialized in premature babies, a children's book about how love means accepting imperfection, a conversation overheard in a grocery store about how the most meaningful gifts are the ones that need our care. By evening, Sophia would understand that her baby brother's greatest magic would be his humanness, his capacity to grow, to learn, to become something wonderful through the simple accumulation of ordinary days. The dangerous wish would dissolve into anticipation and protective love, guided away from supernatural intervention toward the profound, everyday miracle of new life. Margaret opened her eyes to find Emma watching her with expression of wonder mixed with grief. "She'll be okay," Margaret said softly. "They all will be. That's what this is for." As night settled over the mountains, Margaret stood at her bedroom window looking out at stars that seemed closer than they had in her human life. She could feel the network of children's wishes spanning across hundreds of miles, some peaceful, some building toward crisis, all connected through the invisible threads of hope that she had learned to read like sheet music. Tomorrow would bring new wishes, new crises, new opportunities to stand between desperation and disaster. The work would continue through Christmas and beyond, through all the seasons of childhood crisis and supernatural possibility. Margaret had become exactly what the world needed, a guardian of impossible dreams, ensuring that love's deepest wishes found their way toward light instead of darkness. She was home.